19. I want to just say what an honor it is to be able to preach this sermon. I look out and I've got so many good friends here. This is more like family than anything else, isn't it? And as Pastor Jackson said in my introduction, I have served in 4 state conventions over my lifetime. And I want to tell you, I am so blessed to be a part of the Alabama Baptist Convention. I am especially blessed to be able to call as our leader a great man like Rick Lance. The biggest thing in the last year has been talking about a Great Commission resurgence. I think if they just come here before they came up with that, they would have found out how to do it. Because I've been to 9 conventions now, and that's all I hear about is the Great Commission. And I appreciate your leadership in that. God bless you. 1 Kings 19, I'll be reading verses 1 through 4 right after I pray. Lord, thank you so much for the fact that you're here. That's the most important thing. We can't do our work as ministers. We can't face the joys and especially face the trials that we face without the comfort of your Spirit. I pray that you would take your word and make it match people's lives. I pray that you would do more than just give us information. I pray that we might leave here with our downcast souls lifted up. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. 1 Kings 19, verse 1. Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he'd killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "May the gods punish me and do so severely if I don't make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then Elijah became afraid and immediately ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba that belonged to Judah, he left his servant there and he went a day's journey into the wilderness. He sat down under a broom tree and prayed that he might die. He said, "I have had enough. Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my fathers." Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. Here's a man of God praying to die. I think all of us know that there are a lot of people in our country who struggle with depression. The title of my sermon today, by the way, is "When Those Who Give Out, Give Out." And I'm going to speak on the subject of depression in the ministry. We know lost people struggle with depression. Each year in the United States, 500,000 people attempt suicide, 30,000 people succeed. But I think that one thing that we Christians have got to be honest about is the fact that there are a lot of Christians who struggle with depression. William Cooper, the author of the great hymn, "There is a Fountain Filled with Blood," was a man who continually struggled with depression and made several unsuccessful suicide attempts. For instance, one time he tried to poison himself, and all he did was get sick. Another time he put a rope around his neck in order to hang himself, and bless his heart, the rope broke, and so he lived. Another time he decided that he would go throw himself off a bridge into the Thames River. He hired one of those horse-drawn taxis, and one of those famous London fogs came in, and they got lost and couldn't find the Thames River, so he had to just make his way back home. That may be why one of his hymns was entitled, "God Moves in a Mysterious Way." John Henry Jowett, a great preacher of the 1800s, said this: "You seem to think that I have no ups and downs, but just a level and lofty stretch of spiritual attainment with unbroken joy. By no means. I'm often perfectly wretched, and everything appears most murky." One of my heroes, and probably your heroes as well, is Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher. By the way, the last 2 decades of his life, he averaged missing at least one Sunday a year because he was too depressed to preach. Can you imagine sending a note to your deacons at least once a year? "Guys, you're going to have to find another preacher. I'm just too depressed to preach." Most of us would be talking with a pulpit committee right after that. This is what Spurgeon said: "I am the subject of depressions of spirit so fearful that I hope you never get to such extremes of wretchedness as I go to." Well, here we have a case study of a minister in depression. The great prophet who faced down 850 false prophets, 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Ashtaroth on Mount Carmel, called fire down from heaven. One day, the next day, Jezebel, a wicked woman, says boo, and he's running for his life and praying to die. What brought him here? So what I want to do today is I want to look at the causes of Elijah's depression and how God got him out. So let me give you several causes of Elijah's depression. Number 1, he had physical causes. Think about all that had happened in the previous few days. He had been 3.5 years hiding because God had told him to do that. All of a sudden he appeared, had this great showdown on the top of Mount Carmel. Don't you know his adrenaline had to be racing as he stood up there and had the two altars set up. And then he taunted the false prophets as they cut themselves and cried out, "Come on, Baal, bring down the lightning. You're the God of lightning. Bring fire down from heaven." And he taunted them, "Maybe your God's asleep. Cry a little higher." And then after taunting them for probably 6 hours, he then comes and he calls fire down from heaven. Don't you know that got him stoked up? I'm sure his adrenaline was running. After that was over, he took a sword and personally hacked all 850 to death. Now, I've not had an experience like that, but I imagine you could get a little bit tired hacking that many people to death. I mean, would you be still so I can hack you? I mean, don't you imagine your arm would be a little bit tired after all that? And then after he had hacked the 850 false prophets to death, then he went and threw himself on the ground in extraordinary, outstretched praying, 7 times, calling upon God to end the drought that he had called for in the first place. And finally, after 7 strenuous prayer times, he looked and saw the cloud the size of a man's hand. He knew rain was coming. So then what did he do? He ran the 20 miles from the top of Mount Carmel to the capital of Jezreel. That was where Ahab was going. Outraced Ahab's chariot so he could stand at the gate of the city, point his bony prophet's finger and say, "See what I did? See what I told you? See who's really God?" I imagine that he had to be completely physically exhausted after all that, and that was one of those causes for his collapsing in such a traumatic way. Spurgeon preached a sermon entitled "The Minister's Fainting Fits." I recommend it to anyone who can get a hold of it. In it, he gave several good reasons why ministers tend to be more prone toward depression, and one of those was this. He said, the reason why we ministers are prone toward depression is because our souls are attached to bodies. You know, it's hard to be spiritually up and emotionally up when you're physically down. A lot of people have chronic physical problems. Spurgeon suffered with gout, and I believe that some of his depression might have been connected to those flare-ups of gout. One of the preachers I really enjoy hearing is a man named Tommy Nelson, the pastor of the Denton Bible Church. He's the Song of Solomon guy. If you've ever heard that series, I don't know if you've heard about this. He was interviewed extensively on James Dobson. But about 2 years ago, he went through a disabling time of depression. He was out of the pulpit from June until November, completely unable to move, much less preach. He went to the doctor, and the doctor basically diagnosed him this way. He said, "Man, you've been preaching 20 times a week for years." And he had. He would teach a Bible study at least every day, then every weekend go off and do a Song of Solomon's sermon series, come back and preach in his own church several times. His adrenaline was going constantly, and what had happened by keeping that adrenaline turned on constantly, he finally hit a wall, could not even move emotionally, could not even move physically. He had to humble himself and go to a psychiatrist and get some medicine, some serotonin blockers, so that he could begin to restore what his body had torn down by disobeying God's laws and working 7 days a week. Experts tell us that about 10 to 15% of people who experience depression do so because of a chemical imbalance. And can I just share with you a personal word as a pastor? Occasionally I find good-hearted people who turn to people who struggle with depression. They say this: "You shouldn't have to take medicines. If you just had enough faith, you ought to be able to be lifted up out of that." Can I say this? Would you tell that to a diabetic? That if you just had enough faith, you shouldn't take insulin? Now, folks, if there is a definite chemical imbalance, we ought to be grateful that God has given our medical authorities the ability to come up with medicines that can help that. A good friend of mine was Ron Dunn. He's now in heaven. Ron Dunn struggled with depression himself, but his son was diagnosed as being bipolar. What Ron told me about his son was this: his son would do well while he took his medicines, but the problem was after he'd taken his medicine for a while, he would go off of it and then would just crash. On Thanksgiving Day, 1975, his son had been doing so well, he decided to get off his medicines, and on that day he committed suicide. Other illnesses might cause depression. Tim LaHaye of the Left Behind series talked about a preacher friend of his who thought he was struggling with depression, checked himself in the hospital, and to his surprise, he found out that he was diagnosed as being hypoglycemic. And what had caused his emotional problems was the fact that his blood sugar was going haywire, because you know how we preachers eat, and you know how we preachers neglect our bodies, and he had done that in all of his schedule, and as soon as he got back to treating his body right, his emotions began to be restored. So there were physical reasons why Elijah would have gotten depressed. But number two, I believe Elijah went into depression because he was emotionally exhausted. He had just gone through an incredible high adrenaline experience on Mount Carmel. And if there's anything you'll listen to, please listen to this, because this has given me such insight into my own self, and I hope this will help you. The best definition of depression I've ever heard is this: depression is to the emotions what exhaustion is to the body. Have you ever gone outside, maybe did yard work, worked hard all day long until finally you just came in that night, couldn't even move your arms? I mean, you were just completely exhausted, and maybe sat on the sofa, and before you could even eat supper, you were out. You were gone because you were completely physically spent. Well, folks, when we wring our emotions and wring our emotions and wring our emotions, there comes a time when your emotional tank hits empty, and that's when depression sets in. It could be good emotions. Elijah used the spiritual high of the things that happened on Mount Carmel, and yet those good emotions wore him down. Now, once again, if you find somebody their emotions have been wrung and wrung and wrung until they hit empty, you don't go to them and say, "Brother, are you feeling low?" What you need to do then, brother, is you need to spend more time in the Word. You need to spend more time in prayer. Now, you wouldn't tell somebody who was physically exhausted they just need to pray harder and they'd have more physical strength. You know, if you get to the point where you're completely emotionally depleted, maybe you need to go fishing. Maybe you need to take a country walk. I would say golfing, but that doesn't help anything emotionally. I guess that makes it worse. Number three, third cause of Elijah's depression. Elijah went into depression because he was in conflict with people. He had been in hand-to-hand combat with 850 false prophets. But he had the continuing conflict with Ahab and the wicked King Jezebel. And folks, let's just be honest. Nothing drains us more emotionally than when there are conflicts in our lives. So if you have a child who's rebellious right now, and preachers, can we be honest? Many of us have struggled with children that stray. We have to go up there and smile when we preach, and our hearts are breaking because our own children are not following the Lord. If you're in a church where there's conflict, Brother Jackson, you hinted at the fact that you have a couple of members always say no on everything. Danny, I appreciate that mission trip idea. We're going to use that at First Baptist. God bless you. Send them there and leave them there. That's good. I had one particular church that was difficult, and the difficulty was basically because of two deacons. Freudian slip. Folks, I used to literally get sick on the Monday of deacons meeting heading toward that night because I did not know what was going to happen. I remember one time when I was at that particular church, I had an extra hour, just nothing scheduled. So I took my Bible and went and sat out in my yard and was going to have a good time with God. And I opened my Bible and then began to thinking about the things these guys had been doing lately. And before I knew it, the entire hour had passed. And all I had done was think about what these men were doing. I stopped and I apologized to God. And I said, "God, I came out here to meet with you, and all I could do was think of them." When you're in continual conflict, that can spin yourself out emotionally. But number four, I think Elijah went into depression because he had lost hope. He had lost hope. He had mistakenly thought that he had won the battle on Mount Carmel. He'd cried out, "Today is the day when you choose. Will it be God or will it be the false gods?" And the fire fell and the prophets were dead. And then what did he find out? There's still Jezebel in power. And she is still moving the nation towards the false gods. The battle was not won. The fight was not over. And I think he just lost hope. And hope is something you and I have to have. Captain Harold Kushner was captured in 1968, and he became a part of what infamously was known as the Hanoi Hilton, the Vietnam prison of war camp. He said when he arrived at the Hanoi Hilton, he was shocked at the conditions. Not only what they did to them, they not only starved them and beat them and brainwashed them, but he was shocked at the morale of the prisoners. He said he looked around and no one seemed to have any hope in their steps. The spirit was gone from them except one particular American GI. And this GI had become a collaborator because his North Vietnamese captors had told him, if you will work with us against your fellow countrymen, we'll let you go free. He said shortly after that, one day, one of these guards let the truth out of his mouth to this collaborator. He said, "You're a fool. Did you think we were going to ever let you go free? You're going to die here just like all of your friends." Kushner said he watched that young American go to his cot, curl up in a fetal position, and 2 weeks later he was dead. Because you can't live without hope. But can I say this, friend? As Christians, hope is something we should always have. We have the promise of heaven, and we have the promises of God for this life. Verses like Romans 8:28 ought to take us through any difficult situation. But let me give you one more thought. Elijah went into depression because he thought he was all alone. Now, I didn't read the entire story, but when God finally says, "Elijah, what are you doing here? Why are you so low?" Then he gets into the biggest pity party you will read about in the Old Testament. He says, "Oh Lord, only I am left. Everybody else is following the false prophets, and I am left." I think one of the things that causes us sometimes to go in depression is because we forget the truth that the Bible teaches us, that we're not alone. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says everything you're facing, that's common temptations to everybody else. 1 Peter 5, your brothers are experiencing the same trials that you're going through. And yet we like to sometimes act like nobody knows the trouble I see. Oh, friend. Can I make a plea here? Can I make a plea for more transparency and honesty from us preachers and from church members? Because I think what we do sometimes, because we'll go to church and we'll put on our good preacher smile and our good holy countenance. "How you doing, brother? Great. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't the Christian life?" And you know what happens is people will look at us and they'll see us only smiling and only joyful, and they'll come to the conclusion, he's got something I don't have. Because look, when I see him, he's always joyful. He always seems to be above his circumstances. Well, folks, if they knew the truth, they'd know you don't have it either. Because each one of us sometimes gets to the end of our ropes. Sometimes we're about to go under emotionally and physically. And we've got to make a commitment to letting people know not only the victories that are happening in our life, but the struggles that are happening in our lives. We've got to go up there and share our stuff with our people, as well as our victories with our people. Well, how did God get Elijah out of depression? Let me just quickly go through several things God did to bring Elijah out of this. This is so tender. I'm just so appreciative of the way God handled him. Number one, he met his physical needs. Here's Elijah praying to die, and what does God do? He goes to sleep. So after he slept a little while, and that's what he needed, was sleep. Then the angel of the Lord tapped him on the shoulder, woke him up, and the angel had prepared food. And he said, "Wake up now, Elijah, have this food, eat now go back to sleep." Didn't give him a lecture. Just gave him a good meal and told him to go back to sleep. Then woke him up again and said, "Okay, it's time to go now." But one of the things that God did was he met his physical needs. God gave him food and let him rest. The second thing that God did was God convicted him. After he had let him sleep for a couple of days, he finally said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" in verse 8. I believe God's shaming him then. I think God is saying to him, are you the same guy that stood on top of Mount Carmel and claimed that there's one true God that's worthy of following? What are you doing here, Elijah? So many of the great Christians of the past struggle with depression. Martin Luther was one of those who went through seasons of depression. On one particular time, he was going through a period of depression, had not left his room for 2 weeks. And by the way, God gave him a great wife in Katie. If you want to read a good biography, read the marriage story of Martin and Katie Luther. Well, Katie had not seen her husband in 2 weeks except to bring his food into his room. He didn't want to leave the room. He didn't want to talk to anybody. So after 2 weeks, she came in to bring his food, and she had her funeral going dress on. Every woman in that day and time had one black dress that you would wear only to go to funerals. Well, he'd been out of touch for 2 weeks. So he said to Katie, "Who died?" And she said, "Well, God died." And he looked at her and he said, "How dare you blaspheme and say God died?" And she said to him, "Well, I just assumed God died the way you're acting." And that brought him out of that depression and made him leave that room. Number 3, God reminded him that he was not alone. God reminded him that he was not alone. He had said, "I'm the only one left." And in verse 18, God says, "No, you're not. There are still 7,000 who've never bowed their knee to Baal." You know, the irony is that when a person gets to the point where they're in depression, they start avoiding people. And yet that is the time when you need your brothers and sisters in Christ more than ever. Bob Baggett told a story that I heard years ago about a pastor in Florida whose entire life fell apart in 1 week's time. He said this particular pastor had a son who was a college professor, and this, if you remember the 60s, that was the time when you had all of the protests and burning of draft cards and all of those things. Well, this particular son of his, who was a college professor, burned his decree and dropped out of his profession, went to live in a hippie commune. He was one of that generation. So that same week, his daughter informed him that she was leaving her husband and her children because she'd fallen in love with another man, and she left her home, and they had that heartbreak. At the end of that week, I guess all of this piling up, plus the pressures of being a pastor's wife, his wife looked at him and said, "I've had enough of this." And she too left him. So in 1 week's time, he saw his children fall apart and he saw his own marriage fall apart. He took off on Friday and went about 50 miles away to another town and got a hotel and did not leave that room Friday, Saturday, ordered in room service, Sunday, and it was especially painful on Sunday because you know how it would be if you're a preacher. He had not said goodbye to his church. He'd not made arrangements for somebody else to preach. He was thinking, what are they doing now? What's being said? But he stayed there, hadn't shaved for those 3 days. Then on Monday, he finally decided to leave the particular hotel room because he knew the preachers in that area, knew they had a Monday morning pastor's conference, and decided to go to it. When he walked in, here's a guy with a 4-day stubble on his face, wearing rumpled clothes, and 50 miles is not that far. Everybody had heard about it. Walked into that room. You know how we do it, Monday morning preachers meeting. There was a circle around, and some of the greatest lying that ever happens on the Monday morning preachers meeting. How's things going? Boy, God's moving, revivals happening. We went around, everybody was talking about the glorious things that were happening. They finally came to this man, and he told his story. He said, "No, things aren't good." And after he shared all that had happened, he looked up at them broken and said, "Could God ever use a failure like me?" After a few moments of silence, one of the men who started off talking about all the glorious things that were happening in his church spoke up and said, I need to add something to what I shared. There are some good things happening in our church, but you need to know this. My daughter's on drugs and is killing her mother and I. We can't even sleep at night. And I preach and I wonder, what shall it profit a man if he wins his own church but loses his own daughter? I don't know if I can go on because of this worry. And another man stood up and he said, "Look, let me tell you something. I talked about the good things that were happening, but I want you to know our church is in conflict and it's eating me up." And they went around the room, and there was an incredible baptism of honesty that happened in that session. And they joined their hands and they prayed at the close, and God's Spirit came down. Folks, we are not alone. And then the last thing that God did, and this is so extraordinary, God came to him in a still, small voice. Do you remember how God said, "Now I want you to hide yourself here because I'm going to reveal myself to you"? So here he was on the mountain, and all of a sudden there came a tornado, then there came fire, and there came an earthquake. And it said God wasn't in any of those things. And then there was a still, small voice, a gentle whisper, and God was in that. And I'm so amazed that God would find just the way to have a gentle whisper be what he would use to bring him out of his depression. I've been blessed to have only had one rough church experience. I knew before I went there that this was a church that had a history of conflict, but I was convinced God led me to go. I'd been there 4 months when all of a sudden, one Wednesday night, we had a business meeting, and we had one of those business meetings I'd only heard people talk about. It exploded. There was such anger, a lot of it aimed at me, but there was such anger in that room. And it went on for 45 minutes. It would not have stopped, except finally I did have a godly deacon who stood up and simply said, "We're doing no good here tonight. I move that we adjourn." And everybody went home. I remember going home that night and sitting in my chair, and all of a sudden, Winston Churchill called it the black dog. All of a sudden, I had this blackness come over me. Now, I had been discouraged. Every one of us has low moments, but this was my first time to taste the kind of depression that just makes your life stop. For the next 4 days, I couldn't sleep, didn't eat. Now, there's something wrong, but I didn't eat. I was like a zombie. In fact, I did try to leave the house once. Karen asked me to go to the grocery store, and I went to the grocery store. When I pulled up in the grocery store parking lot, I saw a member. I simply turned around and went home. I could not face anybody. The sad thing about all this was there was a young couple that we had led to Christ in a previous church that had scheduled their vacation to come and spend it with us that weekend. So they were driving all the way from Oklahoma to come to Georgia. And they drove in on Friday night. And folks, I want to tell you something. My wife is so gracious and she was so pleasant with them. But I sat there like a bump on a log in the chair. I would hardly even mumble a word. Couldn't even look at them in the eye. I was so captured by that spirit of depression. Finally, on Saturday afternoon, I looked at them and I looked at Karen and I said, "I'm doing nobody any good. I'm out of here." And I went to our church sanctuary. And I got there and I cried. And then I said to God, "God, I want to die." And I want to tell you something, folks. I've never heard God audibly, but I've heard God, and I'm sure you would agree with that. I heard God say to me at that moment, "Okay, you're dead. Write it down. This is the day Steve Scoggins died. It doesn't matter what they do to a dead man. You're dead. We'll just count that." And when I finally came to that place where, okay, Lord, I'm dead to it all, I had the most incredible, fresh feeling of the Holy Spirit. He just covered my heart up, covered my life. In fact, I started running around the sanctuary shouting. And what was so embarrassing is my minister of music walked in to do something. I said, "Sorry, brother, can't stop." That next morning, I was there 30 minutes before the first car drove up. Standing on the parking lot. When the first one drove up, I said, "You're going to tell your grandchildren about today. God is coming down." I gave the invitation that morning, and folks, down the aisles, people were there. God broke through. God moved. I don't know why God led me to preach this sermon, but I know He did. So I just have to assume maybe there's someone here today who either physically you're at the end of yourself, emotionally you're at the end of yourself, because of conflict you're at the end of yourself. Maybe we've done you a disservice and we've not been open enough to let you know you got other brothers and sisters going through it too. But can I tell you this? I believe in a God who can come right now in a still small voice and lift you up. Would you pray with me about that? Oh, my Lord. You called us to serve you, and that's an honor. But Lord, there are times when we've given out. But I'm so grateful that you didn't give up on Elijah, and you're not going to give up on us.